All right, everybody. I think we are live. Thank you for joining us for today's program. This is going to be great, and it couldn't be more timely. Every meeting I'm in, how we go back to work, what's socially acceptable, what's acceptable health-wise is the talk of the town, and you're going to really enjoy our speakers today because not only do they have a lot of information for us, but they're also funny, and I know that that is at a premium right now. So you all know here at the Chamber, our focus has been just laser-like on helping everyone live, work, and thrive in Austin. 2020 and 2021 have been challenging years for all of us. I know that you're all looking for guidance as we work towards returning back to the offices and resuming normal operations, or maybe it's just phasing out our virtual lives. Over the last 14 months, I think we've all learned to do things we never thought we would be doing. And during all of that, we've been keeping our businesses in operation. We've been responding to the diverse needs of our team and trying to keep our employee health front and center. We've been doing this at the Chamber, and I know you've been doing this in your businesses as well. And throughout all this, we've all learned to balance home and work in new ways. I don't know how many pets I know now, but a bunch of them. I've noticed that cats in particular like to be a part of Zoom meetings. So here we go at the Chamber. We've been here with you. I hope that you have been paying close attention and joining us for our webinars. We've been trying to offer you all sorts of relevant content, and today's program could not be more timely. So what we're going to do today is take a look at what trends are here to stay, what you should be focusing on to ensure that your work from home staff have proper cybersecurity measures in place. That's been a hot topic in particular in the last couple of weeks. And our panelists are also going to share with you best practices for bringing employees back to work safely. So before we get started, let's do some thank yous. These things don't happen by themselves. So I'd like to do a special shout out to our pivotal partners. We've got Amazon, Ascension, Dell, PIMCO, and Wells Fargo. I would also like to recognize our foundation partners. You can see them all here on the slide, and to our many corporate partners. And I also want to do a special shout out to the sponsors that made today's event possible. Our presenting sponsor for the Economic Recovery Series, which has been so critical for all of us, is Dell Technologies. Our foundation sustainers are here on the slide, and you can see our corporate sustainers. And of course, our partner for today's event is Baker Botts. And speaking of Baker Botts, I'd like to introduce and welcome Megan Wright. She is the Strategic Partnership Account Exec with Dell Technologies. Megan, it's good to see you here today. And I know we're going to have a great program. So let me send it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for that introduction, Laura, and thank you to the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce for putting on today's event. Dell Technologies was born and raised in Austin, Texas, so we find it extremely important to support our neighbors and small business owners in the central and greater Austin areas. We have seen the impact COVID has had on small businesses in our city, and we're here to be your technology partner to really ensure that your business is pivoting in the right direction through technology. And through our partnership with the Austin Chamber of Commerce, we have had the chance to offer some really great benefits, including connecting business owners with dedicated tech advisors to better understand your specific tech needs and fit you with the proper solution, offering in-house financing options to keep your capital in your pocket, and 24/7 support to act as your personal IT department. So if you would like to learn more, you can visit dell.com/Austin Chamber for more details. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Special Counsel Christina Anderson and partner Cynthia Cole. Christina Anderson's practice focuses on advising and representing employers in all manner of labor and employment matters, including in corporate transactions, litigation of disputes, and workplace investigations. Her clients have included private equity sponsors, public companies, and private companies in the United States and internationally. Christina is joining us today from Rockefeller Plaza in New York. And Cynthia Cole is a former CEO and general counsel. Her practice focuses on corporate, strategic, and technology transactions and data privacy. She acts as outside general counsel to a number of executive teams and boards of directors, as well as advising on mergers, acquisitions, asset purchases, and joint development agreements. She has been recognized most recently by the Silicon Valley Business Journal as a 2020 Woman of Influence. And she is joining us today from Palo Alto, California. California. Thank you so much, Christina and Cynthia, for joining us today, and I will let you both take it away.
Thank you, Megan, and Laura, and Lacey, and Amanda. I think I got everybody that we have been talking to, and thank you. We are thrilled to be able to present to you today. I mean, obviously, we would love to be doing it in person, but additionally, we were just talking about, Christina and I were just kind of preparing and talking about this yesterday, and part of the excitement, I think, obviously underlying some of this is that so much has changed, hopefully for the positive, in the last couple of weeks, right? And so I think anytime there's positive momentum, it's a whole lot more fun to talk about. So I'm really excited to be here with Christina, and I think we can go ahead and get started. So the title of our presentation is Remote to Reopening, and frankly, it's still sort of remote and it's still sort of reopened. So, I mean, it's kind of a mix of both, and I think that's, one of the obviously themes that Christina and I will be touching on is the sort of how do we straddle all of these issues, right, from privacy, employment perspectives, and continue to keep sort of keeping the business moving forward and everyone safe, right? Next slide. So we're going to talk about remote working. We will talk about reopening strategies, vaccinations, masks and distancing, contact tracing, all of which, frankly, have undergone, a revolution in the last few weeks. Managing partially remote workforces, and I think that will be something that companies will be managing for, I think, a while, right? The sort of, again, but some people in the company, at the company site, and a lot of people continuing to work from home. And then key privacy considerations. So we will kick it off with remote working. Christina, next slide.
Thank you. We just wanted to give a high-level view of sort of the state of play right now with respect to remote working. And I feel that, when you follow the newspaper, you see a different article every day sort of discussing what companies are thinking about and what workers are thinking about in terms of coming back to the office. And I think the safest thing to conclude right now is that no matter what happens with vaccination rates and the pandemic infection numbers, we think that remote working will be here to stay. Surveys consistently show that knowledge workers obviously who are able to work from home, want to continue to incorporate at least some part of their week working remotely. The PwC did a survey of 120 US executives, and the majority say that most employees can work from home at least one day a week. So it's not just a matter of employee preference. I think CEOs and business executives have come around to this actually working. Whereas I would say before the pandemic, there was a lot of maybe skepticism of whether this could be possible, but the pandemic has showed that it can. And every day there's another very prominent corporation announcing its policy with respect to work from home. And we put on the slide there a few of the big ones. Citigroup is going to have a hybrid work week. Google also has an interesting policy that it's rolling out, which is that employees can work anywhere they want for 4 weeks of the year. So that's sort of taking into account that employees with children may want to take summer vacation home somewhere, and so they're working, but they're working from a different location than they normally would work from. Mark Zuckerberg has said that he expects about half of his workforce to be working from home within 10 years, which is sort of saying that he views this as a trend that's only going to increase, not sort of a pandemic limited response. And Salesforce is reducing its office space. So of course, there's going to be effects on central business districts and commercial real estate as well.
So obviously, right, in putting all this in context, right, is the security requirements around remote working, having, what should companies be looking at? What laws, what guidance, right, should they be leaning on and sort of paying attention to with respect to just kind of following all of these trends, right? Obviously, there's HIPAA, but HIPAA doesn't apply as often as you might think, right? In sort of practical everyday guidance for companies. It generally centers around the ADA. There's been a lot of guidance, coming out from the ADA or the EEOC. Frankly, those are two really good sources. And then from a more privacy central space is guidance from the FTC, and obviously GDPR, which is the European General Data Protection Regulation that went into effect in May 2018, and then the California Consumer Privacy Act, which went into effect on January 1st, 2020, and then state breach notification laws. So those are kind of some of the biggies. Next slide. So remote working security best practices. And I think, and I was just kind of thinking about this slide and these tips in connection with a lot of what's been in the news lately with respect to ransomware, right? And I deal with ransomware issues for clients. And the first we have it down here at the bottom on training and awareness, right? Ransomware often gets into an organization through phishing. They're very simple. It's actually a very kind of simple entry point. And most often when employees are either not trained, not paying attention, not engaged, or distracted, right, for different reasons. And I think remote working, especially during the pandemic, is a big reason to be distracted, right? And so a lot of these security controls have obviously increased. I mean, the need for these security controls have increased because people are sort of less engaged, right, in their workspace and in their work relationships. And so that's, I think, just kind of an overarching kind of theme with respect to protecting IP, but also protecting just data and just the security, right? Because again, people feel less connected to their workspace because maybe they haven't seen their manager or their colleagues in like a year and a half, right? So those are also things to kind of take into consideration. But some of the best practices, right, are obviously encrypted access points, requiring multi-factor authentication, access limitations, going back and looking at your passwords, right? Administrative passwords to different tools. In fact, a lot of this too is like tools that you didn't have in place 2 years ago. Now companies have in place. They have all sorts of, right? There's Zoom and Microsoft Teams and right, different sort of video conferencing that you use both internally and externally. And oftentimes, the kind of behind the scenes of who has access to the controls and how are all of those controls actually set up hasn't been looked at, right? You just sort of roll it out. Everybody's excited. We're going to be able to sort of communicate in a different way. We'll be able to reach customers in a different way, right? And in fact, it's that back end, setting those controls, looking at them, thinking about them. Okay, how does this really work? Maintaining them is key, right? So obviously updating and testing VPNs, network infrastructure devices, deploying patches on a consistent basis, obviously logs, scanning the logs, making sure that you're actually keeping the logs. Remarkably, a lot of companies don't keep those, and considering full disk encryption. So, and then I think the other thing too that again is, review and update incident response plans. It's essentially reviewing and updating kind of all of these points, right, on a continuing basis. You shouldn't look at security as everybody goes through like a little training module that takes 15 minutes, once a year, right? You should be checking in on all of these tools and trainings and sort of making it a rolling. This should be on a timeline that is essentially indefinite, right? It's sort of how are you going to continue to upgrade and rolling them out and making sure people are engaged. Next slide. And so this is just kind of speaking more specifically to IP, right? And so it's IP, obviously patents, trademarks, but it's also trade secrets and the ways that you do business. So obviously clearly identifying confidential information. Again, and this is much harder, but right, is getting, when people are onboarding, but making sure that they are signing the confidentiality agreements or policies, that they've read them. How are you tracking that? Are you making sure that in fact you've done it in a way that's enforceable, or that reminding people of their obligations, right? I mean, don't hesitate to remind people in a gentle way, right, of their obligations that they signed on to, maybe 5 years ago, and going back and looking at those policies and making sure that you are updating them, right? What's current and what are the tools that you're using, or how have your trade secrets or how has your IP changed? And so how do you need to kind of make sure that you're following through with that? Consider additional measures. Monitor the copying and downloading of data and company files. I mean, that's obviously a big indicator, is when you see a lot of activity on that from that end, right? A lot of emails being sent to personal email addresses, downloading of information, even if it doesn't look on its face to be sensitive. There could be something around it that's sensitive, right? And then again, continuing to provide training just all the time, and checking in with your employees and having conversations about security and about the importance of protecting the company's assets. So again, remote working, red flags, missing email, programs recently uninstalled or installed, emails, to personal accounts, evidence of forensic programs used to delete information. Obviously, that's a huge red flag. Evidence of cloud-based remote storage services, transfer of large amounts of files from network to local hard drive. Another thing is that when you have a BYOD policy, which frankly most companies do, or they have BYOD procedures in place and no policy around it, right? Make sure that you have a policy, and make sure that you are alerting people of your policy and then following through on it, right? Because so much of all of this activity is frankly happening on individuals' personal devices, right? Which you ultimately have a lot less control over. So next slide. Reopening strategies. Christina?
I think that's me. And I just wanted to say with respect to the last slide, a lot of those things are flashpoints for me as an employment litigator as well. If someone's downloading a lot of data or deleting a lot of data, forwarding things to their personal address, that's something's going on there too. So keeping track of those things has sort of two benefits. Okay, next slide, please. Great. So we wanted to talk about sort of what are some of the main elements of a reopening strategy that companies should be thinking about. And I think the three big things are vaccination, what policy to adopt with respect to requiring vaccination of your employees. Contact tracing is still relevant. We won't spend a lot of time on that, but we'll address why it's still relevant. And the last is sort of a two-pronged discussion, which is sort of mask mandates / social distancing. Like, what's the status now of those requirements when you're getting to pretty good vaccination rates in some populations? And the big sort of caveat to all of this is that CDC, other federal agency guidelines, states and local governments, everything is just constantly changing. Like, I believe a few days ago, California announced that that requiring vaccination is acceptable in California of private employees. So it's just keep your eyes and ears open as much as possible.
So again, we get to sorry, I was thinking about what Christina said and thinking about trying to tackle all these things, right, on your own. And, you know, so make sure that you are tapped into like the Austin Chamber of Commerce and different, you know, different resources, third-party resources that can help you get relevant information, ask what other companies are doing, right? I mean, I think so much of this is trying to stay on top of all of the information and the flood of different sources. And sometimes it seems conflicting. And so, you know, it's very important to make sure that before you roll out a policy that you've really vetted it, right, properly. But anyway, so relevant privacy and security laws, again, HIPAA, the ADA, EEOC guidance, again, they put out a lot of guidance and we've relied on that, you know, tremendously throughout this whole process. Obviously, different states, right on their websites, you know, on the front page of whatever, you know, either the Attorney General or the different health, right, the different health organizations for each state have all of this information pretty readily available. And they're working really hard to update it, right? So, and then obviously GDPR, if you have, you know, if you're collecting the personal data of European residents, right? So again, if there are people who are residing in Texas, even if they have a European passport, GDPR doesn't apply, right? So that's sort of a key question that I get a lot. But obviously, if you have further reach than that and you're collecting the data of European residents, that's a little different story. But again, they're all very different. They all get to their results in different ways, right? All of these different regulations, but they all are ultimately geared toward helping companies stay in business, right? And keeping people safe. And so they're always trying to find that balance. And, you know, they just get to it sometimes at different speeds and in different degrees. Next slide. So,
Okay,
yeah.
Vaccination requirements. So I bet everyone's head is spinning over some of this stuff. So I hope this next couple of slides are helpful to you. You can advance. Thank you. So the big high level point here is that the EEOC, which sort of governs workplace discrimination issues, has issued guidance that employers may require employees to receive an FDA authorized COVID-19 vaccine before coming back to work. And pursuant to the Americans with Disabilities Act, there must be opportunity for employees to dissent from such a policy on the grounds of medical or religious exemptions. And I think the rationale for allowing a vaccination mandate is that, you know, businesses have a legal and ethical obligation to provide a safe environment for customers, for third-party vendors coming into the office, and for their own employees. You know, one thing that's been sort of controversial and discussed is this idea of vaccine passports. And it seems like the general sort of conventional wisdom is that this might not work that well in the United States. Like people have some hostility towards it, but the technology is being developed. And I know Cynthia and I were talking before today, preparing, and she said that at her father's place of work that they're required. So it's not that it won't happen anywhere, just that it is unclear how widespread it would be. And just another caveat with respect to local laws, there's a Florida executive order, which strikes me as maybe a little bit more performative than enforceable, but nonetheless, it's important to keep abreast of, that bans COVID-19 vaccine passports. So, you know, again, local law is going to really govern what's going on here. So based on my preparation for today, I believe that most U.S. companies are comfortable with requiring proof of vaccination. Let's put it differently, that it's more likely than not that if an employer as preference is to require vaccination, that they'll feel comfortable doing so, because there seems to be a critical mass in that direction. There was an Arizona State University and Rockefeller Foundation survey of different companies across various industries, large businesses, and a broad majority said that they will require proof of vaccination and or provide incentives to be vaccinated. And those incentives don't necessarily have to be financial. They could be a day off of paid time of PTO to get vaccinated. It could be, any number of sort of creative things that you can come up with to encourage vaccination. Universities are announcing pretty regularly that they're going to be requiring students to come back vaccinated. Delta, another big employer, announced all new hires will be vaccinated. That's interesting to me, this distinction between new and existing. I think it might have something to do with this idea of consideration. So when you hire an employee, you're in exchange for their employment, you're offering you're offering compensation, but in the same time, you're expecting certain things from them. So maybe Delta looks at the vaccination requirement as sort of like a non-compete in exchange for an offer of employment. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of recommendations and best practices that Cynthia will cover. And I'll just jump right to the end really quickly, which I know maybe a lot of people are thinking about. Any mandatory policy must allow for exceptions pursuant to the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as religious accommodation requirements. That's not on the slide. The slide just sort of focuses on the main metric with respect to disability. Like if an employee says, look, I can't get vaccinated because I have X, Y, and Z condition, then that's not the end of the story. Employers are allowed to sort of assess what the risk of allowing an unvaccinated employee into the workspace is vis-a-vis the possibility of accommodating that person. Like if the person can work from home, that would probably be considered in the eyes of the EEOC a reasonable accommodation for a person who can't get vaccinated. So I'll allow Cynthia to handle the others.
But Christina, before I talk about data minimization principles, there's a question, and I think it's a good, So you can read it, except that my eyes are too much screens, right? I can read it. Can you read it?
If you require vaccinations for employees to return to work, is there legal exposure that your company might assume for negative side effects for an individual employee from the vaccine? That's a good question. I think in terms of employee litigation, anything is possible, but I think given that the EEOC has stated that there's no discriminatory, no relationship between mandatory vaccination and any of the laws that protect employees from workplace discrimination, I think the likelihood of any kind of claim like that would be very, very low.
And I think, I was thinking about what you said, and I think the other side of the coin on that is that if you didn't require a vaccination, right, and so then you have a workplace where you have, let's say, a majority of people who aren't vaccinated, and then someone gets sick, I don't know if that's a greater risk. Possibly, right? Because then you maybe have contributed to an unsafe work environment, right? So it's always it's a balancing act. That those are not easy choices, but anyway, that was just something I was thinking about. So
right, I would say that if an employee calls in and says, "Look, I'm feeling really unwell from the vaccine," I think it's the absolute best policy unequivocally is to allow them to take time off regardless of whether or not you have a policy, and generally should be paid time off. There shouldn't be any penalty for doing so.
That's a good point, Christina. And I have worked with a lot of our clients, right, who have had a lot of employees who have been not knowledge workers, right? I mean, they actually had to show up. And if they were either sick, or if they were not allowed to come back to the workplace because they had been exposed to COVID, right, through a family member, I know a lot of our clients have made the choice to pay them for the time, right, where they weren't working. And again, these are employees that, are punch the clock employees, right? And they still chose to pay them in order to, obviously not penalize them for the fact that it was the company's policy that they not come into work, right? So again, it's a kind of, anyway, yes, yeah, that's a good point. But as always, right, I mean, the same sort of privacy considerations around any kind of sensitive information that you're collecting, whether that's from a customer or a vendor who's coming on site, whether you're doing it through an app or electronically, or whether you're doing it in a paper form, right? These health declarations and the sort of logging people's temperatures and those kinds of things. You know, it only collect the amount of information that you absolutely need to serve the very tight purpose that you've defined, right, internally as to why you need this information, right? So again, just always thinking about, you know, boiling it down to what is it that you need, and then what are you going to do with it? Who has access to it? Where are you going to keep it? And what is the, you know, what is its deletion schedule? What is its schedule to be deleted, right? Again, always thinking about, you know, there are considerations, reasons that you would keep this information that go beyond, you know, a certain kind of, you know, 30 days or 60 days or whatever it is, right? But again, really hammer that out internally and understand why you are keeping it. Otherwise, just delete it. I mean, honestly, if you can't come up with a good reason to keep it, then just make it go away, right? And in a very like foolproof way is my recommendation to clients. So again, only collect information that's essential to protect the health, right, of the individuals that you are, you know, that you're responsible for in your place of work. And then observe disclosure limitations, right? So again, making sure that that information, once collected, is only available to a very small group of people who absolutely need to know it, right? And if possible, limit, you know, with whom you're sharing that information. Do all of those vendors or third parties or the people who run the apps, you know, are you looking at, do you understand like with whom they're sharing, or have you taken a look at those policies, right? And then implement high security protocols, again, so that people are just they're less engaged, right? Which is what, you know, I was mentioning at the beginning. So again, just reminding people that it's not because you're working from home that that you should have, you know, kind of less attention to these issues. It's actually more important. So those are the points from that.
And then we briefly just wanted to talk about contact tracing. It's a little bit of a holdover. Oh, I see another question. So maybe we'll do this slide and then I'll answer that. A little bit of a holdover from pre-vaccine world, but nonetheless, there is a requirement to maintain a safe workplace on the part of employers. And so it's advisable. OSHA has been sort of like missing in action for a lot of this pandemic, but it's nonetheless advisable to track any cases. If an employee calls in and says, I'm not feeling well, I tested positive for COVID, to sort of figure out what the potential exposure is to your other employees.
Yes. No, and I was thinking about what you were saying, and then I was looking at this about the third-party apps, right? I mean, these third-party apps, so many have sprung up very quickly, and their policies, frankly, are pretty loosey-goosey, you know, when we review them. And so, you know, again, just thinking about, is it worth the risk of sharing this kind of information for the, you know, it's a constant balancing, right, between risk of sharing with someone, a third party in particular, who's running an app or doing a, you know, a hosted service that might not have the best security protocols and might expose the company further in a direction, you know, that you frankly can't afford, right? So, sorry, I was reading some of the comments. But, and I just think, yeah, so, you know, just being careful about reading those policies, making sure that they're vetted, making sure, again, that all of this information that you're collecting is on a short deletion cycle, unless you have a, you know, extremely relevant reason for keeping it. So. you want to get to the question about the difference between religious and personal beliefs, Christina?
Yes.
On sort of objections?
And I'll just say, like, I'm sorry if you hear screaming. I'm not like torturing an animal. It's my 10-month-old baby who's very talkative. The question that was posed is there a difference between religious and personal beliefs? Yeah, there's a difference. There's a difference. I mean, the problem is that it's a little bit hard to parse that out, right? Like, I really wouldn't want you to be in the position where you sort of call a flag on a person's beliefs and say, I don't really believe that's your religion. I just don't think you want to be in that situation. So, practically speaking, probably there is, but I would try to take everything at face, try to take everything on as a good faith request, unless you really believe that it's not, unless you believe that there's sort of something bad faith or something dishonest going on. But generally, I wouldn't try to draw that line.
And I guess I would add to that too. I have seen kind of an increase, right? And as the percentages of vaccinated, individuals increases, there's so many kind of social pressures and different issues. And so, I mean, just echoing what Christina is saying, taking people on their good faith, kind of applying these policies in good faith, trying to stay above the fray of that discourse, which obviously can get political as well. And I just think it's, I know it's difficult to manage all of these things, but again, that's why it's just so important, I think, also to really have a key kind of group of people, whoever's making the decisions about this, right? Really vetting these decisions internally before you roll them out, making sure that all of the stakeholders have input, right? So that, again, internally, so that you are kind of taking all of those different perspectives into consideration and trying to understand those before you roll out a policy that then you have to go back on because, you didn't really consider X over here because you just didn't think about it, right? So again, taking that time can save some, wobbles on the back end.
Right, and you don't want to have sort of a situation where you have managers in different departments making different decisions on this stuff. It's not ideal. It's not fatal, but it's not ideal.
Yep.
Okay, so then we want to talk about the second prong of reopening, which is mask mandates and physical distancing and what will be done about that. So this is a big one. A few days ago, the CDC issued guidance that apparently took the White House by surprise, that fully vaccinated people do not need to wear a mask or physically distance during outdoor or indoor activities, large or small. So obviously that's a workplace, right? The guidance doesn't apply to certain places, like hospitals, nursing homes, and prisons, but otherwise it was sort of broadly applicable. And a few days later, Dr. Fauci, the president's chief medical advisor, spoke on one of the Sunday morning television shows and said that he expects the CDC to issue guidance with, quote, significant clarification of that no mask anywhere for vaccinated people rule, especially with respect to mask wearing protocols in a workplace. Almost immediately after the CDC guidance, major retailers announced that they're no longer requiring vaccinated workers and not requiring shoppers to wear masks in stores, although shoppers don't have to provide proof of vaccination. I think probably my best guess for the decision making in that situation is that there had been a lot of reports of scuffles between employees and customers about the mask mandate, and Costco and Walmart didn't want to sort of put their employees in the position of being a policeman for a policy that the CDC says is no longer required for vaccinated individuals. So in the next slide, we sort of address what now with respect to physical distancing. So again, the guidance drops the requirement of physical distancing for vaccinated persons. And I know that a lot of companies had sort of been planning throughout this period of with the vaccinations coming online to reopening, but reopening with mask mandates, maybe still with temperature checks, maybe with desks separated from each other, maybe with sort of workflow arrows on the floor. and a lot of that is being reconsidered right now. So I think the only real unequivocal guidance we can give is consider the preferences of your employee population. Maybe consider doing a survey, and consider, try to come up with various plans, right? Like as in various options. Like let's say most people want to come in. Okay, then you have your answer. But if people want to come in, maybe most people want to come in on a staggered schedule. Maybe most people want to continue working from home until the vaccination rates have increased. Sort of, it seems like maybe do the least, take the lowest common denominator of those kind of various preferences. And again, keep in mind what your state is saying to you and maybe even what your city is saying to you.
So one other thing I would think, Christina, I haven't looked at this recently, but I do know that I think what they were saying originally about the vaccines, right, is that there is a sort of a need to, this isn't going to last forever, right? Wasn't that sort of the guidance around vaccines? So I think it's also worth considering, this could change again. This sort of guidance and information could change again in 6 months when they come out and say, no, everyone who's been vaccinated has to be revaccinated, or it's totally worn off.
You mean
right?
like
or there's a new variant?
Yeah, that's a really fair point. It's a really fair point. So if you have a very large employee population, maybe it's better not to rush at this point.
Right. I mean, I don't have an answer. I raised a question I don't have an answer to, which I do often. I apologize, but I think it's worth thinking about, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess and I know, frankly, personally, from my own perspective, right? I just feel like, wait, is this for real, or is this or are we kidding, right? Like, what's going to happen, in 3 days? Everything sort of is changing all the time, and so I guess I'm just kind of it just echoes my own personal state of mind. But I think as an employer, right, again, just trying to really look at, and again, having that core group of people and making sure, like Christina said, all the managers are kind of, you're getting buy-in from sort of all the stakeholders. So again, you're really kind of thinking more long-term and having a flexible policy and a flexible approach.
Okay, so this next slide is sort of maybe some pro tips, or basically just some ideas really for managing a hybrid workplace, which is to say managing a workplace where you maybe continue to have a lot of remote workers. So on the next slide, we go through some possible ideas for that. Because as been discussed, or maybe people have been thinking about, there are problems, there are potential sort of HR or employee relations issues, new ones that come up when you have a sort of laissez-faire remote work policy. Sort of, you have these questions from employees, well, if I don't come in, do I risk losing that promotion? Is there a meeting that happens that I don't know about? There's sort of fairness considerations as well. And there's also just generally sort of like operational considerations, like what if everyone does Monday through Wednesday and and no one does Thursday and Friday? Like, do you keep if you have an office cafeteria, do you keep it open on Thursday and Friday? Like, there's a lot of like workplace planning considerations if you just sort of open the gates and sort of see come what may. So some ideas here. Yeah.
So Christina, I guess my question too would be, but what if you're noticing that there's, certain individuals that their work product really is dropping off, right? So again, if you don't have a policy or guidelines around this,
right,
then it's much harder to enforce, right, sort of productivity levels or, right, different issues if you have problems.
Right. I mean, I think, and that's always an issue, sort of, as I always have my like employment litigator hat on, it's always an issue. Performance management is difficult when everyone's in the office. People are hesitant to give negative feedback. They don't want to be seen as the bad guy. And then if you add on top of that, sort of out of sight, out of mind, you have managers who are really not the type to kind of like really give people performance feedback. Then you have a problem where an employee gets fired and they say, but I was never, ever given a chance to improve. I was never told that there were issues with my workplace. Or conversely, you have sort of like I've been picked on because I chose to work from home, full time, 100%. So I agree that in this situation that I think there has to be some real thought put into the policy. That's one of the sort of decision trees. What happens if performance starts to suffer? What are the remedies for that? So here we have sort of a list of some recommendations, right? So maybe have some guidelines for office required and office optional circumstances. Like maybe a performance review must happen in the office. Doesn't matter if the person's 100% remote, that has to happen in the office. Client meeting has to happen in the office. It just really, this sort of depends on your particular business, right? Another idea is to consider office weeks as well as office days. So instead of allowing employees to take a schedule Monday through Wednesday in the office, Thursday, Friday, you'll say, actually, no, the first and third, what we're going to do is the first and third weeks you'll be in the office and not the second and fourth weeks. And then maybe that works better for the way your business, where the operations requires, right? I could sort of imagine if you're like putting out a publication, you might need people to be in the office the week before publication date, but the earlier weeks you don't need them. Necessarily, you don't need that collaborative element. Another idea here is to rotate teams and non-employees. So this is more about, this concern about remote working, that you lose the collaborative benefits that Zoom just doesn't make up for in-person conversations. So then therefore sort of teams adopt a work from home schedule, not individual employees. Another idea here is sort of encourage work days at home to be focused on big projects that need like large blocks of time for the person to think and not be disturbed by sort of colleagues knocking on the door. Because something you hear a lot is sort of like more introverted leaning employees prefer to have the freedom from sort of interruptions that maybe disrupt their flow. Another thing, the next sort of
You mean like my pets and my children?
Sorry, Cynthia?
You mean like my pets and my children?
Yeah, right. I mean, maybe you want to go in the office to get away from that.
Right. So I'm saying that's an office is a better choice. Go.
No, it's fine. Yeah, someone was saying you notice that all the people in the office are the ones with young children. Like he has 4 young children at home. He wants to be here. This next one, normalize online communication. I think for a lot of employers where this is relevant, that has happened. But make it so that it's the policy. Like if you're going to be brainstorming something, if you're going to be workshopping something, it should be as well electronically available.
And I would just jump in there. But if you're normalizing it, then make sure that someone has read the protocols and the security protocols and who has the admin passwords and right. So again, also just checking in. Even if it's maybe not something that's been rolled out as an official tool of the company, if you're seeing, or you're seeing that, a lot of small teams or different groups within the company are using a particular app or a particular tool, consider then normalizing it, right? Bringing it on board and making sure that you set the right security protocols around it. So that's something.
That makes total sense. And actually at our firm that happened. We're sort of moving to use Microsoft Teams where there's a chat function, but policies have been set in place in terms of retention of the chats. So, we're encouraged not to have substantive sort of client discussions on Teams because it's not going to be retained. Mini offsites, again, this is like another idea where maybe you don't want to do rotating teams, you can't get people's schedules aligned, and maybe you don't want to do work weeks. Maybe what you do then is every 3 months, there's an offsite for 3 or 4 days for a team to get together. The second to last bullet is sort of employees' individual circumstances matter. Sort of like think about, what people need and don't need and try to be responsive to that when you're setting up a policy. But on the other hand, childless workers shouldn't feel less favored for work from home than people with children. I think that's a really important point. And I also think, you risk not just the childless and child line, but also that's like a little bit of a generational line too. You don't want to have all the younger people feel that they have to be, quote unquote, slaving away in the office while the middle managers get to be home.
Yeah, no, those are great points, Christina. And I guess I would say it's important I talk a lot about privacy and training from the privacy and security perspective, but I think there are some opportunities. It's also a burden, but there's some opportunities for management training, right? With respect to, again, how do you have those discussions or difficult discussions with employees over a Zoom meeting, or how do you maintain a performing sort of culture when people are working remote, or they have a lot of other pressures, right? And so it's, I guess I'd like to say that it's frankly an opportunity, right, to kind of train around things like empathy and working. How do you show empathy over a screen, right? I mean, but it has to be done because you have to continue performing, right? So it's it's hard, but it is, I think, an opportunity maybe for, sort of better practices. So just to kind of, I think this is our last slide, but key privacy considerations. Next slide. So again, and all of these principles align, right? Right, in sort of privacy, security, employment, management, right? Transparency, right? Transparency. Make sure that you are communicating the reason. I mean, you have to legally. Okay, so this isn't like a nice to have. This is you have to do this. This is a requirement now, right? Whereas it wasn't a requirement necessarily a couple of years ago, but with the CCPA, now Virginia, different state, obviously under the GDPR and different state laws that are changing with respect to privacy, right? You have to be transparent about the information that you're collecting, why you're collecting it, what you're doing with it, with whom you're sharing it, the retention period in a lot of cases, and right, disclosing what your practices are around that information. And people are asking more questions related to those because they know that that's the law and that the law is changing, and there has been so much sort of publicity about these changes, right? So again, clear communication is key. Ensure that your privacy policies are updated and that you've provided supplemental privacy policies as necessary. And this is something, honestly, that is shocking to me, is that I still go on company websites and I see privacy statements or policies. Sometimes I don't see any, which is shocking, or I see one from like 2015. And I think, oh my goodness, wow, right? I mean, these are, think about, again, in communicating, what is the image, what is the sort of face that you have to the outside world? And especially now more than ever, it's your webpage, right? And it's your online disclosures. And all of those things are being monitored, they're being looked at, and they are, leaks, right? If it's not done correctly. Again, looking at having a very narrow reason, right? Keeping those reasons for collecting information to a very narrow purpose. And that purpose is, exactly what it is you're trying to do. And then again, having it on a deletion rotation, making sure that where you're storing it before you delete it is actually secure, and how you're doing that. And I would really encourage, with respect to security, hire a third party to come in and do an evaluation, right, of sort of your security protocols and what is necessary, and then sort of be working toward that. Because again, security is, there has been a marked increase in cyber attacks, ransomware, different issues, and it is just not that hard to get into just about anybody's network infrastructure, right? So, also again, just running through the tabletop exercises and making sure your incident response team, again, especially if they're dispersed because they're all working from home, are available and ready to react, right, quickly if there's a problem. And I think, those are sort of the main issues from
I
a
have a
privacy
question for you,
perspective.
Cynthia.
Yeah.
So one thing I thought of is if let's say a company moves to work from home policy, permanently post-pandemic, and hard copy documents need to be sent to individuals' homes. Like what do you do about home address availability? Like is there a portal that everyone can go to find everyone else's home address, or that's not appropriate from a privacy perspective?
So what I'm seeing, okay, so that's a good question, and that came up recently for a client in a little different context. So one thing is I'm finding that DocuSign, right, and those kinds of are just obviously, those are, frankly, I don't know what you would need. There are very few things now that would require sending like a hard copy. I think you could frankly have most things are legally enforceable with an electronic signature, right? And so that's the first part of your question. The second part is with respect to home addresses. You can take employees' home addresses and you can share them within a particular group, right, for a particular purpose. But again, you have to, you always have to allow people to opt out of that and give them an alternative. But also, if you just have to be clear about what the purpose of keeping that information or sharing it with other people and making, it's those same principles apply, right?
Yeah.
Any questions from
the virtual audience
that we can't see? No? Oh, okay. Ready to wrap up. Well, are we still in?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks again. I know these are big questions, and companies are dealing with them in different ways, right? And different things. And I think a lot of it has to do with the tools. I have a lot of clients now who are asking about rolling out facial recognition tools, right, for security reasons and different things. So I think, it's examining what those tools are, making sure that you're really reading the fine print, and being transparent in those disclosures, right, with people. So again, there are a lot of opportunities, but there's still quite a bit of risk.
Okay. Well, we're near the top of the hour. Okay, so Christina and Cynthia, most importantly, thank you. Couple of the takeaways I got out of this are, one, it's going to be really important to make sure that people communicate to their employees that we'll pivot, right? What makes sense in June may evolve in July, and setting up expectations for this to be an evolution versus a set of hard practices, I think is really, really important. The second incredible takeaway that I got out of this is that everyone should be as nice as humanly possible to their HR and ops teams. And so, to that end, I want to do a giant shout out to ours, which is led by Colleen Pate, who's our chief of staff, and Sarah Lenore and Terry Bolin and Simone Leal. I can tell you from my perspective, every time we've had a policy change, we've had almost 100% of employees call with questions. And so this is time consuming, but important work. And I think it sends an important signal to people about whether or not you are walking your talk when you say you care about workforce concerns, you're empathetic and all of that. How you handle these policies, how you answer questions, all of that just becomes so very important. So you've given everyone a lot to chew on and to think about. Certainly a lot of decision points and an enormous amount of flexibility. And I would say giving each other the grace to be flexible is going to be really important as we move forward with this. Yes, I'm assuming that the answer is yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Christina and Cynthia have both kindly agreed. If you have a question and they didn't touch on it, or it wasn't asked by someone else, reach out to us and we'll make sure to get it to them and have the question answered. And so this is an ongoing conversation. We'll be bringing more of this content to you as we all start to reopen our offices, whether full on or in phases or however that works. I think it'd be great for us all to stay in touch and figure out what the lessons are, what to run towards, what to run away from. And Christine and Cynthia, again, thanks so much for the time you've spent with our members. I know this conversation is really important to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.